Hello, I'm Tootight Lautrec. Welcome back to the Shakey Sonnet Show. We're here in the Sonnetarium at the bottom of the down staircase in the recently sequestered remainders section of an unnamed local library, which may or may not have a lion couchant or two guarding the entrance. Today we're going to talk about Sonnet 4, but before we do, let's talk about sex, baby. Now, some people think that I'm a pervert. But back to Sonnet 4. You may ask, why is it that Tootight Lautrec feels the need to sexualize everything whenever we talk about the sonnets, particularly these first sonnets? Well, let's think about that for a moment. The first 17 sonnets are sonnets encouraging someone to procreate. And how exactly does that happen, procreation? Anyone? Anyone? Yes, that's right. Sometimes anyone will do, but that's a topic for another video. Harking back to some words of wisdom, don't be coy, avoid, or make void the topic. What we have here is subject to controversy. A 3-letter word some regard as a curse. See? Shoop. Yes, that's right. We can thank Salt-N-Pepa for those words of wisdom, our ambassadors of goodwill and good sex from way back in the 1990s, when many of you were nothing more than just a twinkle in your mommy and daddy's eye. So now that we've got our heads on straight about sex and our girdles pulled tight, let's dive into Sonnet 4. And if you do have a problem, or if you're offended by talking about sex, then I suggest you see someone about that, because that's the way the world goes round, honey. So, before we get into the actual text of Sonnet 4, let's talk about a few things that we're going to see in it. There will be lots of talk about money. There's lending and spending and usury, which is the lending of money at an exorbitant rate, audits, legacies, and a lot of this talk about money is double talk about sex. They serve as a kind of a wink and a nod as terms that hint at sex. And if you don't believe me, I suggest that you look up the term money shot on Google or some other wonderful search engine. And after a few hours, after you've finished your business, you can come back here and join the conversation about Sonnet 4, and you'll see what I mean about money and sex being not necessarily synonymous, but they play with one another, if you will. Also, I'd like to mention that, as we've noted in the first 3 sonnets, there's often a lot of talk about death, and I would like to remind you that in Sonnet 3, I said that it's not necessarily romantic to talk about death when you're trying to woo someone, but actually to die was an Elizabethan euphemism. It's not a euphemism, it's an Elizabethan euphemism for orgasm, the little death, for instance, when apparently because the life force oozes out when one dies, and also when one's life force oozes out in the middle of a joyous act as well. So hence the line at the end of Sonnet 3, die single and thine image dies with thee. Well, die single, as in if you are dead, then your legacy will not live on, but also die single if you're in your room all by yourself, then that will go nowhere except into the dirty laundry the next morning. So death, money, these are terms that may sometimes serve as a hint, a wink, a nod toward sex. Okay, let's go through it line by line. I'll start by reading the entire sonnet, and then we'll talk about it as a line by line reading. Sonnet 4. Unthrifty loveliness, why dost thou spend upon thyself thy beauty's legacy? Nature's bequest gives nothing, but doth lend, and, being frank, she lends to those are free. Then, beauteous niggard, why dost thou abuse the bounteous largesse given thee to give? Profitless usurer, why dost thou use so great a sum of sums, yet canst not live? For having traffic with thyself alone, thou, of thyself, thy sweet self dost deceive. Then how, when nature calls thee to be gone, what acceptable audit canst thou leave? Thy unused beauty must be tombed with thee, which, used, lives the executor to be. So, first of all, we'll look at it. It's a series of questions, rhetorical questions, that proceeds in a chiding sort of manner with these terms of not necessarily endearment. Unthrifty loveliness. Well, unthrifty isn't necessarily a positive attribute, but loveliness is. Beauteous niggard. Beauteous is wonderful. To call someone a niggard is to say that they are a hoarder. They keep everything to themselves and won't share with anyone. Profitless usurer has no necessarily good qualities associated with it. And so there's this bit of a chiding tone to the sonnet, which could be playful, or it could be simply someone who's not terribly fond of the other person, but apparently they are. Now, also, if you look at, excuse me while I look at my notes, if you look at the terms of, they are sexual terms. The very first line, unthrifty loveliness. Why dost thou spend upon thyself thy beauty's legacy? Well, if one spends upon oneself, what do you imagine happens? It's basically the fountain of joy, is what I'll call it. And yes, that is appropriate. That's the money shot. There we go, right at the very beginning. And there are many terms like that. Spend means to ejaculate. Free, when we get to the fourth line, could mean either free of charge or it could mean promiscuous. So here we have someone, unthrifty loveliness. It's someone speaking to somebody else. Why dost thou spend upon thyself thy beauty's legacy? So in a literal sense, you're wasting yourself. It would be better if you didn't simply waste your seed, if you used your seed to good use and implanted it somewhere where it could be fruitful and grow. Nature's bequest, basically the last will and testament, nature's bequest gives nothing. So everything that nature has to you, nature will also take away. She lends it. And being frank or being generous is what frank means. She lends to those are free. So you're sitting there freely accepting everything, but you're also being promiscuous and frittering away all the things that nature has given you, all the good things that nature has given you, as if they're going to be there forever, and they won't. Beware. The second quatrain. Then, beauteous niggard, why dost thou abuse the bounteous largesse given thee to give? So in other words, you're keeping everything to yourself. Again, it's the same theme. Don't abuse it. You have a beautiful inheritance. Spread it around. But also, why dost thou abuse the bounteous largesse given thee to give? If you've ever been accused of abusing yourself, you may remember what that might mean. if you're just sitting around masturbating, nothing will ever get done. Although, well, we can talk about that later. Profitless usurer, why dost thou use so great a sum of sums, yet canst not live? You've got all this, that you've hoarded all this treasure, and you're still not using it to good use. For having traffic with thyself alone, thou of thyself, thou sweet self, dost deceive. It seems to be that there's a dead horse in this sonnet, and Shakespeare just keeps beating it. It's the same thing over and over, said in a different way, with an implication of masturbation and with an implication of waste, where it's not necessarily advancing the argument, it seems to be simply just reiterating it. And then there's this line 11 and 12. Then how, when nature calls thee to be gone, what acceptable audit canst thou leave? Now, if you're having trouble understanding that because it doesn't seem like normal English, I don't blame you. Then, how, when, what doesn't seem to make sense. I could see how either it would work with the word how gone or with the word what gone. Then when nature calls thee to be gone, what acceptable audit canst thou leave? Or then how, when nature calls thee to be gone? No, I can't see how that works. It simply seems to be a word placed for the meter and no actual sensical reason for it to be there. But in the nature of the preceding lines, it's simply saying, again, you will die. You're going to have to put your gifts to better use. And then again, thy unused beauty must be tombed with thee, which used lives the executor to be. The only thing that was going to be carrying your progeny is the sock at the end of your bed tomorrow morning, apparently. So it's quite a repetitive poem. It's interesting in the sense that it has these questions, these rhetorical questions as it goes throughout. And it's interesting because it's somewhat sexual. But it doesn't seem to proceed in any way, shape, or form with a reasoned argument. It just seems to beat the point home. And maybe that is the point, too. Sometimes you just need to beat the point home, don't we? Okay, so that's Sonnet 4. And I'm looking for any kind of an indication if there's a man or a woman who could be the recipient of just such a poem. And yes, a man or a woman could be just a recipient of a poem. Excuse me. Yes, a man or a woman could be the recipient of the poem, but it's not necessarily one or the other. Does it fit in with the story of the sonnet sequence that perhaps Shakespeare was commissioned to write this for someone? Yes, of course it does. What could the dramatic possibilities be for this? Well, it could be two young people chiding one another, saying, you know, you're so good, don't waste it all on yourself, share some of that with me. I could, for instance, imagine in Much Ado About Nothing, Beatrice and Benedick. This could be a sonnet that one or the other gives or writes in the other's absence, intending to give it to them, because they've got quite sharp tongues and they're sparring all throughout the play. And in fact, there's a moment at the end of the play where they again deny that they love one another, but other people say, oh, but I found this sonnet that this one wrote for you, and you should read it. And I could imagine Sonnet 4 as that sonnet. In the end, Beatrice does get her Benedick. Benedick, by the way, is spelled B-E-N-E-D-I-C-K. And as some of you may or may not know, bene, B-E-N-E, is Latin for good. And dick, D-I-C-K, is English. Okay, that's all for today. Go out and enjoy the world. Pay attention. It's full of wonder. You never know what you might encounter. If you do, if you are old enough of the age of consent, be respectful, be responsible, and for goodness sakes, have fun. Until we meet again, I'm Tootight Lautrec. Mwah.